Well, good afternoon, and thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to share with you some of the findings of my research on the Pick-Sloan plan. As Mark mentioned, I've collected a lot of data over the years, but today I'm going to focus on the major themes of the development and evolution of the plan and its impact of its single projects on the on the Native American tribes along the river, with an emphasis on the three tribes that are in your area of the river. I'll then end with a summary of the cost-benefit analysis of the original purposes of the Pick-Sloan dams, in which I conclude that the plan has created a seemingly unsolvable nightmare for the Corps of Engineers. Public support for the establishment of a Missouri Basin Water Development Program in the early 1940s was driven in large part by crises. There had been devastating floods in the lower basin in 1942 and 1943 that had impacted a wide area, including the major cities of Omaha and Kansas City. But as a result of the Dust Bowl drought years of the 1930s on the northern plains, there was also an increasing demand for reclamation projects in the upper basin to facilitate crop irrigation. The Bureau of Reclamation had, since the late 1930s, been researching how best to develop dam projects on the Missouri and its tributaries in a program that would eventually be directed by William Glenn Sloan, who was an engineer based in the Bureau of Rec's regional office in Billings, Montana. The Sloan plan proposed projects to irrigate 4.8 million acres of land, primarily in the upper basin, at a cost of well over $1 billion. The Army Corps of Engineers came rather late to the party in the summer of 1943, but rapidly developed proposals under the direction of Colonel Lewis A. Pick. The primary objective of the Pick plan was to provide for flood control and improve navigation in the lower basin, but it also wanted to develop large multi-purpose dams that would additionally provide for hydropower generation, irrigation, recreation, and municipal and industrial water supplies. Its estimated budget was $490 million. The Corps' hasty planning was driven in part by what it saw as a need to find domestic projects for its personnel once World War II had ended. Colonel Peck had no education or experience in building dams, but he had gained stature during the War of the Pacific by directing the building of the critical Lido Road to transport troops and supplies in Burma, or what is now Myanmar. So the two agencies developed proposals separately, and neither of them paid much attention to the potential environmental impacts, such as sedimentation, bank erosion, the destruction of cultural and religious sites, and the depletion of native plants and animal and fish species. Neither of the agencies give much real heed to the social, cultural, and psychological impacts their projects would have on those populations that would be forced to relocate. This photo shows General Pick and South Dakota Governor M.Q. Sharp, who was a strong supporter of the Pick plan, at a ceremony in which they pulled the cord to start a pile driver that marked the official beginning of the construction of the Fort Randall Dam in 1946. Sociologists and cultural anthropologists have coined the term, quote, involuntary resettlement, unquote, to describe the forced relocations caused by public works projects around the world. And there are several dam projects under construction now that will exceed the size of the Pick-Sloan dams, for example. These social scientists have found that there is an engineering bias that affects these development projects. Such a bias tends to neglect social planning and characteristically understates the challenges faced by a proposed project, resulting in an inclination to both ignore the host population and put excessive pressure on the environment. Development projects almost universally incur cost overruns at the same time that they underfinance resettlement expenses and underestimate the number of people or families that need to be displaced. Finally, social science researchers have found that forced resettlement, more often than not, creates an inflated market for replacement lands, goods, and services. Well, in response to the Missouri River floods of the early 1940s, President Franklin Roosevelt favored the development of a Missouri Valley Authority, or MVA, to administer a vast development program. And this was an idea that was first forged by Nebraska Senator George Norris in the 1930s, who was actually also the established legislation for the Tennessee Valley Authority. The MVA was envisioned as an independent public corporation, which was patterned after the successful Tennessee Valley Authority, or the TVA, that had been developed in the 1930s. So to head off momentum for the MVA, the Corps of Engineers and the Bureau of Reclamations, two bureaucracies that did not have a high regard for each other and probably don't continue to do so, decided to try to consolidate the separate Pick-Sloan plans. At a two-day conference that was held in Omaha in October of 1944, the two agencies quickly decided to merge their plans. In a one-page document, they agreed to go forward with 107 of the 113 projects in their separate plans. James Patton, who was then the president of the National Farmers Union, famously described the consolidation of the Pick-Sloan plans as, quote, a shameless, loveless shotgun wedding, unquote. No attempt was made to consolidate or justify cost. Exact project dimensions were never specified, and a considerable amount of duplication of the two plans remained. The two agencies ignored the issue of whether there was sufficient water to provide for both irrigation in the upper basin and navigation in the lower basin, even though Sloan himself publicly doubted that there was enough. The agencies also failed to address the details of how hydroelectric power would be distributed and how administration of the two plans was to be coordinated. Nevertheless, despite these ambiguities, the joint plan was rushed through Congress with no real public debate. Less than 10 weeks after the Omaha Conference, on December 22nd, 1944, Congress and President Roosevelt authorized the Pick-Sloan plan as part of the Flood Control Act of that year. Originally designated as the Missouri River Basin Development Program, the plan was authorized an initial budget of $200 million. The evolution of the Pick-Sloan plan essentially turned out to be a successful power play for the Corps. Because it was given a free hand to develop the main stem projects on the Missouri without having to answer to an effective overall administrator, such as the MVA. In the end, the Corps also managed to construct all of the projects it had proposed, whereas many of the Bureau of Reclamation's proposed projects for major irrigation projects and tributary dams was eventually downsized or deauthorized. For example, the Garrison Diversion Unit in North Dakota was considerably downsized, and the Oahe Diversion Unit in South Dakota was deauthorized in 1982. In my opinion, a water development program for the basin would have been better managed under an MVA. The experience of the TVA in the Tennessee Valley was far from perfect, but it did seem to have a better overall coordination and was more concerned about the social impacts of its projects, if less so about their environmental impacts. So the Corps developed 5 new multi-purpose dam projects on the Missouri. And as you can see from this map, going from north to south, there's Garrison in North Dakota, and Oahe, Big Bend, Fort Randall, and Gavin's Point in South Dakota. The Corps also incorporated the giant Fort Peck Dam into this system, which the Corps had constructed in Montana in the 1930s. Now, the dams and reservoirs created by these projects rank among the largest in both the United States and the world. For example, the Fort Peck Dam is the largest dam in the United States, and it's the second largest in the world. Oahe and Garrison also are ranked among the 5 largest dams in the US. And the lakes created by the Pick-Sloan projects represent 4 of the 10 largest reservoirs in this country. This photo shows the demolition of the town of Cheyenne Agency on the Cheyenne River Reservation in 1960. The agency was relocated 60 miles west to Eagle Butte, South Dakota. Because the Corps wanted to avoid flooding population centers such as Bismarck, Pierre, Yankton, and Sioux City, its projects had a large impact on Native American reservations along the Missouri. In fact, the Pick-Sloan plan eventually caused more damage to Native American lands and resources than any other public works project in America. Yet the Flood Control Act of 1944 contained no provisions governing the taking of lands on Indian reservations. This despite the legal precedents that such confiscation must have either specific authorization from Congress, the consent of a majority of the tribes themselves, or both. The 1944 statute also failed to address the tribe's priority rights to waters flowing through the reservation, as established by the United States Supreme Court in the legal precedent of the Winters Doctrine of 1907. Just on the main stem of the Missouri, the Corps condemned approximately 355,000 acres, the equivalent of 554 square miles of reservation lands. From north to south on this map, the reservations impacted were Fort Berthold and Standing Rock in North Dakota. I say Standing Rock in North Dakota because that's where the agency is, but as you can see on the map, most of the actual reservation is in South Dakota, but also Cheyenne River, Lower Brule, Crow Creek, Yankton, and Rosebud reservations in South Dakota, and Santee Reservation in Nebraska. The Corps confiscated the most land at Fort Berthold, 152,000 acres, and the least at Rosebud, 585 acres. But the Oahe project just north of Pierre took the most Indian land of any of the single projects, a total of 160,000 acres on the Standing Rock and Cheyenne River reservations. Now, the research for my books have focused on the impacts of the 7 Sioux reservations along the river and did not describe in detail the damages caused to the Fort Berthold Reservation in North Dakota, the home of the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara tribes. On the 7 Sioux reservations below Fort Berthold, approximately 600 tribal families were compelled to be removed and relocated. The primary towns and villages and BIA agencies on many of these reservations had to be evacuated and reestablished on higher ground. An exception to this was the self-sufficient village of White Swan on the Yankton Reservation, which was located just northeast of the Fort Randall Dam site. There, the residents were merely dispersed to wherever they could find new residences, and their village was never restored. As a consequence, there's long been a grassroots effort on the Yankton Reservation to try to reconstitute a White Swan community. Now, this is a photograph of the construction of the new Lower Brule town site in 1964. And you can barely make out in the old town site near the river in the upper right-hand corner. On the reservations where the most acreage was inundated, the Pick-Sloan dams destroyed 90% of the timberlands and about 75% of the wild game and plant supply. Trees along the Missouri had provided the Sioux tribes with their primary source of lumber and fuel and protected both man and beast from the ravages of winter blizzards and scorching summer heat. The gathering and preserving of wild fruits and vegetables was a traditional part of Sioux culture. The numerous varieties of herbs, roots, berries, and beans that grew in the bottomlands added nutrition, bulk, and variety to the diets of tribal families. Many were also used for medicinal and ceremonial purposes. The wooded bottomlands served as a shelter and feeding ground for a variety of wildlife, and the hunting and trapping of this game provided reservation residents with an important source of food, income, and recreation. The loss of the bottomland grazing areas seriously crippled tribal livestock operations, which had been a thriving economic enterprise on many of the reservations. Artificial shelters had to be constructed to replace the natural woodland shelter belts. Substantial amounts of new fencing had to be erected, and new feed and water sources developed to replace the natural resources of the old habitat. Stock raising thus proved to be far more difficult, expensive, and risky. Now, damages caused by the Pick-Sloan projects touch every aspect of tribal life. Abruptly, the tribes were transformed from a subsistence to a cash economy and forced to find new ways to make a living. The necessary relocation of the BI agencies at Cheyenne River, Lower Brule, and Crow Creek disrupted federal services and disorganized the social, economic, political, and religious life of well-integrated tribal groups. It also had a serious effect on the entire population of the reservation. Now, it was an onerous imposition for tribal members to have to relocate their schools, their health clinics, their churches, their community halls, and religious shrines. It was even harder for them to disturb the graves of their ancestors and to excavate their cemeteries and other burial sites. The Corps of Engineers did an especially poor job of managing the exhumation and reburial of graves. For example, on the Yankton Reservation, because the Army did not maintain good communications with tribal representatives, tribal members did not become well aware of the need for grave removal until a construction crew accidentally excavated 2 burial sites and dumped the remains into the Fort Randall Dam embankment. The Corps eventually relocated 509 graves at Yankton, mostly from church cemeteries, but it failed to do an adequate job of working with tribal members in identifying isolated burial sites. As a consequence, the fluctuating waters of Lake Francis Case continue to periodically unearth skeletal remains, caskets, and funerary objects in the area of the former White Swan village. Now, this is perhaps the most widely publicized photo depicting the emotional impact of the Pick-Sloan dams on the tribes. It shows the chairman of the 3 affiliated tribes wiping away tears as the Secretary of Interior signs a settlement agreement for the taking of tribal land on the Fort Berthold Reservation for the Garrison Dam project. Physical losses inflicted by the Pick-Sloan dams are more easily quantified than the psychological and aesthetic damages. Like any people forced to leave their homes, Sioux tribal members hated to give up their land and seek unfamiliar places to live. But their peculiar circumstances made the situation even more difficult, as I will describe momentarily. Unlike others affected by public works projects, they were not able to replicate their former way of life by moving to a similar environment. After the Missouri River bottomlands were inundated, no environment like the old existed anymore on the reservations. Now, much of the needless problems experienced by all families, both Indian and non-Indians, who were forced to relocate, came as a result of the federal government's failure to provide an adequate administrative structure for the Pick-Sloan plan. The administration of President Truman placed the program under the rather loose-knit coordination of the Missouri Basin Interagency Committee. Because the MBIAC was not created by statute and did not have the force of law, and because it did not receive any separate appropriations, it quickly fell under the domination of the Corps of Engineers. The Sioux tribes were not well informed about the Pick-Sloan plan until long after the Flood Control Act was approved. Despite the fact that treaty rights provided that reservation land could not be taken without their consent, most of the tribes were not formally consulted prior to enactment. The Corps of Engineers was so confident that it could acquire the reservation land it needed through condemnation that began construction of the dams, including those that were actually on a part of reservation property, even before opening formal negotiations with respective tribal representatives. For example, the Yankton Sioux tribe first officially became aware of the Army's plans when the Corps of Engineers started moving equipment onto the Yankton Reservation to begin construction of the Fort Randall Dam project. The Pick-Sloan plan was thus presented to the tribes as a fait accompli. The federal government was determined to move tribal members out of the way, and there was simply nothing that they could do about it. There were not the factors that are in play today that might have resulted in effective opposition and better settlements. Intertribal cooperation was then virtually non-existent. The tribes did not join together to make their voices heard or to seek a collective settlement. The individual tribes were too politically fragmented to permit organized opposition. Access to influential members of Congress and competent legal counsel was severely limited, and no activist organizations took up the cause to protest, and tribal members were not then inclined to take radical action. In other words, there was simply not either the political or cultural environment in which there could have evolved the kind of coordinated opposition we have witnessed in recent years, for example, in protest against the Dakota Access and Keystone pipelines. The Pick-Sloan dams created a stressful situation for all of the people who lived in or near the Missouri bottomlands that were forced to relocate. Both Indian and non-Indian families had to give up their homes, their farms, and their ranches and find new residents and lands to settle elsewhere. However, there were situations that made removal a particular disadvantage for tribal members. As I have indicated, the natural advantages of their former lands could not be replicated on the marginal reservation lands that remained after inundation. The barren and upland regions to which these tribal members were forced to move proved to be less hospitable, more rigorous, and presented a far greater challenge to their survival. Leaving the reservation to find better lands was not an attractive or even a viable alternative, because it would have meant the loss of both federal services and close kinship and community ties. In comparison, non-Indians forced to relocate had more freedom to find comparable housing, fertile lands, and grazing areas elsewhere, though it might also mean that they would have to break long-standing family ties to communities and perhaps to leave lands that their ancestors had homesteaded. On the other hand, many tribal members were advantaged by relocation to the extent that the relocation often resulted in an improvement in their living conditions. Many, if not most, were living in poverty, and remarkably, even into the 1960s, in homes that still had no electricity, running water, or plumbing. Government replacement homes usually had modern conveniences, although adequate insulation was not usually one of them. And on the other hand, not all of the tribes affected were able to secure new or even adequate housing for families forced to relocate. For several tribal members, however, the transition increased their creature comforts at the same time that it greatly diminished the quality of their overall life. For example, they might have had to give up living on their family allotments of up to 320 acres, where they maintained subsistence gardening, farming, and raising livestock, in exchange for life in a cookie-cutter home in a crowded housing project within the newly built private town sites. I think the greatest loss, however, was the tribe's cultural and economic connections to the resource-rich Missouri River bottomlands and to the river itself. In my discussions with younger tribal members today, I find that they have no real sense of what life along the river was like for their ancestors in regard to either its advantages or its distinct hardships. The Corps was pretty hard-nosed in dealing with property owners, both on and off the reservations. This began with their damage appraisals. Army appraisers showed up at the properties and came up with a bottom line valuation which did not itemize individual features of the property. In the beginning, the appraisals did not even cover the cost of actually moving the property or improvements. But the Corps later amended this process to allow a relocation allowance of 20% of the property appraisal. The property owners could either accept the blind valuation or challenge it. Either way, the conveyances were officially transacted through condemnation proceedings in U.S. District Court. Those property owners who challenged the Army's appraisal in court usually received higher settlements. However, they also had to cover the expense of hiring both an independent appraiser and an attorney to represent them. Only a very few Indian families challenged the Army's appraisals in court. Most of the conveyance of reservation properties were made without court appearances by tribal members. This photo illustrates what some reservation housing was like before construction of the dams. On the Standing Rock, Cheyenne River, Crow Creek, and Lower Brule reservations, the Bureau of Indian Affairs conducted separate appraisals through its Missouri River Basin Investigations, or MRBI unit, which was based in Billings, Montana. At Standing Rock and Cheyenne River, the tribes themselves hired their own outside appraisers who came up with higher valuations than either the Corps or the BIA. After the parties failed on each of these 4 reservations to reach a settlement in the field, largely because the Corps refused to budge from its original appraisals, Congress stepped in to assert that it would legislate final settlements. In this regard, these tribes had the advantage over non-Indians forced to relocate in that both the BIA and Congress stepped in to help them get better settlements than had been offered by the Army. But the legislative process required tribal representatives to plead their cases in congressional hearings, and the legislature consistently came up with compromise in terms of both cash and provisions that was far less than the tribes had requested. The timeline for the legislative process was also unpredictable. For example, the Cheyenne River Sioux tribe received a settlement from Congress for damages caused by the Oahe Dam in 1954. But the Standing Rock tribe had to wait for 4 more years to gain a settlement for impacts caused by that same project. The Standing Rock tribe received a congressional settlement in September of 1958, but the Corps did not provide it with funding for actual relocation until January of 1960, at which time the Army issued an immediate eviction order. Thus, in the midst of a fierce Dakota winter, with temperatures falling as low as 30 degrees below zero, tribal members were forced to rapidly gather all their possessions and evacuate their lands. Because funds had not yet been made available for the construction of new homes or the relocation of old dwellings, these people were crowded into cold and cheerless trailer houses, which they had to maintain at their own expense until permanent housing could be prepared. Now, there were numerous glitches in the relocation process, as you might imagine, but I think perhaps the worst error is what the Corps of Engineers managed to do at Lower Brule and Crow Creek. After removing families from the Fort Randall project, it then changed the specifications of the Big Bend Dam, which meant that some of those same families had to be relocated a second time. Beginning in 1984, the tribes at Fort Berthold and Standing Rock asserted claims that they had not been adequately compensated for the loss of lands and resources taken by the Pick-Sloan dams or provided with adequate replacement infrastructure. After these two tribes were successful in getting Congress to authorize additional and more equitable compensation in 1992, the other tribes, with the exception of Rosebud, followed suit. As a result, between 1992 and 2002, Congress established additional compensation packages for the Cheyenne River, Crow Creek, Lower Brule, Yankton, and Santee Sioux tribes. This photograph shows yours truly testifying before a congressional committee on behalf of the Crow Creek Sioux tribe in 1996. In total, counting Fort Berthold and Standing Rock, Congress established tribal trust funds to be used by the tribes that had an initial value of $671 million. Now, the way this funding was structured, the tribes are perpetually entitled only to the interest on the trust fund, which over the course of many years will exceed the value of the actual appropriated amount. This means that the historical value of those trust funds will someday be billions of dollars. Now, you're probably most interested in what happened on the reservations nearest your part of the river, and so I will summarize that for you. Overall, the impacts tended to be less dramatic on Yankton, Rosebud, and Santee reservations because, obviously there was less land that was condemned. This photo shows a family residence in the community of White Swan before construction of the Fort Randall Dam. The Corps of Engineers began construction, initial surveys at least, for construction of the Fort Randall Dam in 1945. In the following year, it condemned lands needed on the Yankton Reservation for parts of the construction of rights of way for an access road connecting to US Highway 18 near Lake Andes. In that same year of 1946, the tribe learned for the first time that the village of White Swan would be completely inundated. In 1947, the Corps condemned 31 additional tracts on the reservation and eventually took a total of 2,851 acres. In 1948, the BIA finally stepped in to try to help the tribe gain additional compensation and conducted its own appraisals. After it failed in extended negotiations to reach any agreement with the Corps, it proposed a legislative settlement in 1949. In the meantime, as late as 1950, tribal members had still not received any payment from the Army. When they did receive payment, they were given little time to relocate. There was no BIA assistance, and the Corps somehow failed to serve proper eviction notices to all affected tribal members. One individual later reported that a Corps representative came to his home and advised him that if he did not move by 9 a.m. the next morning, his house would be set ablaze. He later wrote, quote, "They came at 4 o'clock in the evening, so it was burned," unquote. Some families also waited too long to make their move, leaving the Corps with no alternative but to abandon the houses. One family remembered watching the swirling waters of the rising Fort Randall Reservoir separate their home from its foundation and carry it into the stream. As I have mentioned, there was no effort made to move the White Swan village to higher ground, as the Corps and the BIA had worked together to do on the towns and villages on the other reservations. As a result, the White Swan residents had to scramble to find housing elsewhere. The majority moved to Lake Andes or to Marty. Many moved into the Lake Andes motel that had gone bankrupt. Several leased or purchased a 1 or 2 room homes that came to be known as, quote, the Lake Andes shacks, unquote. In one of these, 14 family members occupied 1 2-room house. Many tribal members lived in these homes until they died. Others left only after a tornado destroyed some of the homes in early 1960s. By 1954, the BIA had been trying for 5 years to get additional compensation from Congress for the Yankton. It proposed additional compensation of $245,000, but later in that year, Congress only authorized a settlement of $106,500. There was a lot of controversy over the distribution of the funds. Some of the families that had been forced to move were not compensated, and the distribution of funds did not take place until 1956. This was 9 years after the lands had been condemned and 6 years after the families had been forced to remove. As you might imagine, this created jealousies, resentments, and hard feelings that still resonate across the Yankton Reservation. This photo shows the inundation of reservoir timberlands. You know, on many of the reservoirs, the trees were not removed, and many of them remained above water for consistent time, which hampered navigation in these reservoirs, which was one of the reasons why, one of the main purposes of the Pick-Sloan dams. The Roosevelt Sioux tribe lost 585 acres to the Fort Randall Dam project, and this included 20 acres on Hiramwood Island that the Corps somehow lost track of and did not provide for any compensation. All of the acreage was taken through condemnation without tribal consultation and for an amount that was the equivalent of $15 an acre. This compared to $87 an acre that the Yankton Sioux tribal members had received in their initial settlement. There was no separate tribal or BIA appraisals or a congressional settlement for Rosebud. Neither was any study by the BIA, was there any study by the BIA to determine what the impacts might be. And Rosebud is now the only tribe on the river that has not received additional compensation for lands taken by a Pick-Sloan project. This photo illustrates how reservoir waters endanger tribal cattle. In the spring of 1952, the Corps of Engineers began construction of the Gavin's Point Dam, the smallest of the Army's dam projects on the Missouri. This project would require the inundation of 593 acres on the Santee Sioux Reservation in Nebraska. This represented about 8% of that small reservation's land base. The taking area was mostly bottomland pasture located just below the main settlement area of the village of Santee. At least 8 tribal families lived within this taking area. Unlike the situation at Yankton and most of the other reservations, the Santee Sioux tribe was given considerable advance warning that it would be impacted by the Gavin's Point project. A government representative briefed the tribal council in May of 1949. The BIA's Missouri River Basin Investigation Unit also became involved early in assessing fair market value of the properties to be flooded. To its credit, the Corps invited the MRBI to assist in an initial joint appraisal. The MRBI also conducted a separate appraisal that concluded that the total value of all damages was $52,000, a higher amount than the joint appraisal. At a meeting held in Omaha in October of 1955, the Corps negotiated an agreement with the tribal and BIA representatives. It provided that the Army would file a, quote, friendly, unquote, condemnation suit to settle all claims, that $52,000 would be deposited to the credit of the tribe, and that the tribe would have the right to retain all improvements without any deduction from the amount of the money deposited. The Santee Sioux Tribe Council approved the settlement in November of 1955, and I think that that's when the time when the actual relocation took place. However, the U.S. District Court did not award the compensation until early 1958. This meant that there was no allowance for the possible increase in property values since 1955. After the Fort Berthold, Standing Rock, Crow Creek, and Lower Brule tribes were successful in gaining additional compensation from Congress in 1990, between 1992 and 1997, the Yankton and Santee tribes began a joint effort in 1998, to also attain more equitable settlements. Democratic Senator Tom Daschle of South Dakota, who then served as the majority leader, spearheaded a bipartisan effort to provide additional compensation to the tribes. And this legislation was supported by Senator Chuck Hagel of Nebraska, as well as Congressman Tom Osborne, the congressman who had previously been the successful football coach at the University of Nebraska. The proposed legislation did not proceed to hearings until July of 2002. But at the very end of the 107th Congress in December of that year, President George Bush signed into law legislation that established recovery trust funds for the Yankton and Santee Sioux tribes. The fund for Yankton was capitalized at approximately $23.2 million, and that for Santee at $4.8 million. All of these later settlements represented advantage that tribes eventually had in comparison to non-Indians who had their lands and resources condemned for the Pick-Sloan project. And that was that Congress, in recognition of the United States trust responsibility to the tribes, agreed that they had not received fair market value for their losses. It therefore tried to make their compensation more equitable. And one of the things I've tried to do in my books is to analyze a cost-benefit ratio for the Pick-Sloan Dam projects. In other words, to try to describe whether the projects have accomplished the purposes for which they were originally developed, and the extent to which the people who sacrificed the most for their development have benefited from these projects. Now, I have focused primarily on the cost-benefit ratio for the Sioux tribes, who essentially waited for years to get any benefits at all. But I think that much of this negative ratio applies to all of the people of the Dakotas. There is no doubt that the people of North and South Dakota made the greatest sacrifices in order to make the Pick-Sloan Dam projects possible. They are also the ones who also have to continue to deal with the project's increasing problems, such as sedimentation and fluctuating water levels. But it seems that many of the most substantial benefits have accrued to the people of other states. For example, the greatest share of the flood control and navigation benefits are realized by the people of Missouri. Citizens of Nebraska can claim the largest share of hydroelectric power and water supply. South Dakota only receives about 19% of the total economic benefits of the Pick-Sloan power projects, despite the fact that the Owyhee, Big Bend, and Fort Randall power plants generate about 70% of the system's overall normal hydropower capacity. There's also the fact that since 1975, the hydropower generating capacity of the 6 dams has been substantially reduced. This has been largely due to the Army's need to control water releases in order to meet other project purposes, such as flood control and navigation, and certain environmental and legal mandates. Irrigation has become the abandoned orphan of the Pick-Sloan plan. The large main stem project proposed for the Dakotas never materialized. For example, South Dakota was promised that it would be able to have 950,000 acres of newly irrigated lands. But Congress deauthorized construction of its main delivery system, as I had mentioned, the Owyhee Diversion Unit, in 1982. This is a photo that shows President Kennedy at the dedication of the Owyhee Dam in 1962. Navigation on the lower Missouri River has become the Pick-Sloan benefit whose value is most often questioned today. The cost of constructing and maintaining a 9-foot deep navigation channel along the 735 stretch of the main stem between St. Louis and Sioux City, and now that extends up to Ponca State Park, has amounted to billions of dollars. However, commercial traffic on the river has never met the Army's original expectations, and the net annual benefit of navigation has only been a few $1 million. Of all the benefits promised by the Pick-Sloan plan, water-based recreation is a program purpose that has most exceeded all original expectations. Recreation is also the purpose whose benefits accrue mostly to the area where the projects were built. 75% of the benefits go to the 3 states of North and South Dakota and Nebraska. And of these, South Dakota enjoys the most benefits with 36% of the total. The Lewis and Clark Lake behind Gavin's Point Dam attracts the most recreational visitors of any of the Pick-Sloan reservoirs. Another original purpose of the Pick-Sloan projects was to increase both the supply and quality of water, especially for municipal and industrial purposes. While the mainstem dams did immediately provide an almost unlimited supply of water, up until the early 1980s, most of the communities, factories, farms, and ranches in the vicinity of the reservoir were still dependent on groundwater sources of questionable quality. Since that time, water supply, in common with recreation, is a Pick-Sloan benefit that has expanded far beyond original expectations. Municipal water intakes now serve as the primary source of water for millions of people, primarily in the lower Missouri Valley. There are also hundreds of intakes that provide for water for industrial, agricultural, and domestic purposes. However, as with many aspects of the Pick-Sloan programs, the supply and quality of water is increasingly facing problems. The necessity of the Corps of Engineers to release water at the downstream dams to serve other system purposes has at times adversely impacted upstream water intakes. Also, the quality of water within the reservoirs themselves has been deteriorating for many years. This is due to many factors, including the growth of algae, elevated concentrations of heavy metals in both water and sediment, and the widespread runoff of agricultural pesticides. But as this group is particularly aware, sedimentation and siltation issues have diminished the water surface area of the reservoirs, which has in turn decreased recreational opportunities. Now, this is a cartoon from 1949 that was entitled, quote, "The Last Stand of the Sioux," and it shows a tribal family observing the construction of the Oahe Dam. It is unlikely the Corps of Engineers' Mammoth Missouri River projects could have been permitted even if they had been proposed 30 years later in the 1970s. By then, the giant regional water development projects were losing political support, their economic justifications had eroded, and people were growing more concerned about the environmental and social costs of projects like the Pick-Sloan Pick-Sloan dams. There also been widespread and well-organized opposition by tribal and environmental activists. The implementation of federal protective statutes, such as the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966, the Environmental Policy Act of 1969, the Clean Water Act of 1972, and the Endangered Species Act of 1973 would have made it nearly impossible for the Army to obtain environmental clearances. Since that time, Congress has also enacted the Archaeological Resource Protection Act of 1979 and the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act of 1990, which have greatly expanded the protection of cultural resources at the same time that they have further constrained the actions that federal agencies can take in regard to the development and management of public works projects. Development of the Pick-Sloan projects has created a managerial nightmare for the Corps of Engineers. In the perpetual and challenging act of trying to delicately balance water releases to maximize the purposes for which the dams were built, the Army has never been able to satisfy the needs of the diversity of stakeholders in its projects. In short, it cannot provide all of the water or power they need all the time. At the same time, the Corps appears to be fighting a losing battle to try to mitigate the substantial and ever-increasing damages its projects have caused to the environment. These include the destruction or deterioration of native flora and fauna, and animal and fish species, as well as the decline of water quality and the rapid increase in sedimentation and siltation caused by fluctuating water levels and bank erosion. And on that rather pessimistic note, I will conclude my presentation, but I thank you for your time and your attention, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have. But I'd just like to point out that this last illustration is a drawing by a Lakota artist, Dwayne Wilcox, that depicts the dispossession and relocation of uprooted tribal members. This is specifically, again, focused on the Oahe Dam. Again, I thank you for your time.
Thank you, Michael. We really appreciate it. Are there any questions? Okay, hearing none. Michael, we appreciate it. Thank you for your time.
Can you hang on?
Very interesting talk.
Yep. I haven't had a chance to look at the chat here closely. I did have a couple questions, Mark, if you don't mind.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. Michael, I was just curious, when did your research start, or how did it start? And how did it grow, I guess?
Well, it started in, I was a graduate student at the University of Nebraska at Omaha in the early 70s, and I was looking for a thesis topic, and my counselor had recommended that I look at the impacts of the Garrison project on the Fort Berthold Reservation. And, you know, I was sort of focused on that's what I would do. And then I discovered that that had already been explored in a book-length articles in the journal North Dakota History. And as you're probably aware, theses and dissertations are supposed to be original works. So I then looked at, well, I think I'll focus on the impact of the Oahe Dam on the Cheyenne River Sioux, and that's what I wrote my thesis on. And, you know, got my master's degree there in 1973, and then went to graduate school at the University of New Mexico. And then I thought, well, you know, I'll just expand this thesis to also include the other Sioux reservations on the river. And, you know, I finished with that program in 1978 and submitted what was then my dissertation to the University of Oklahoma Press. And they published my dissertation with not too many revisions in 1982. And, you know, at that time I was working for the Bureau of Indian Affairs in what was then the Aberdeen area office in Aberdeen. And I was later transferred back to Washington, D.C. and spent another 10 years with the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And then once I left the Bureau of Indian Affairs to become a private consultant, I was asked by the tribes to get involved in these efforts to get additional compensation. And so that I was involved in that for 10 years after 1992. And then I thought later I added like 6 more chapters to the original Damned Indians book that was published by the South Dakota State Historical Society in 2009 as Damned Indians Revisited. So. That's the short story.
Okay. We do have a few questions here now. Are there any existing settlements still outstanding with any of the tribes?
Well, there's been some momentum for the Rosebud Sioux to also get a further additional compensation. That that's far from being, that's just a thought at this point. The what is now the MHA Nation at Fort Berthold has been fighting with the state of North Dakota about who owns the mineral rights to the former Missouri River, whether it belongs within the Fort Berthold Reservation. Does it belong to the tribe or does it belong to the state? And that is being presently investigated by the Department of Interior. And of course, that's a very rich oil rich reservation up there, and there's active drilling in the riverbed and a lot of revenue that comes from that. So those are the two areas that I can think of. I think that the Omaha and Winnebago tribes in Nebraska have thought at various times if they had any claims for impacts that might have been caused. There was no land really taken for the dams, but there is issues involving how those dams affected their water quality and supply, in those reservations in Nebraska.
We've got another one here. At this point in time, is there any chance for Yankton to recover hydropower benefits as a stakeholder in the taking of their lands?
Well, I think that there are lots of stakeholders that are looking at different ways of how the Missouri River can recover and more equitable distribution of the benefits. And I don't know exactly how that might be accomplished in dealing probably with the Western Area Power Administration. But the distribution certainly, and I don't know if there's more, if the Dakotas have a greater need, but certainly, the hydropower, most of the hydropower goes to other states. And in North Dakota, for example, at the Garrison Dam, that most of that power goes to Minnesota and to Canada. And I think that there's room for reevaluating in that if they can determine that there's a market.
Okay, we've got a few more questions coming in. One person asks, look into your crystal ball. What will the future hold for the basin and the river in the next 50 years?
Well, the thing that I like to look at in the future ball is that dam projects, even earthen dams, these giant earthen dams, have a lifespan. And as they continue to have more problems, at what point, there's dams that have been destroyed and established the natural flow of the river in other places. They're not quite as big as these dams. But I wonder if there comes a point where you try to do away with the dams and recover the old meandering Missouri River. That creates a lot of problems because then you would have miles of land that for years have been covered with water. And I don't, but I don't think anybody looks at what is the end life of these projects. And I just think that the problems are increasing, and as I say, I think it creates a managerial nightmare, and I don't know how you can solve it to the satisfaction of all of the stakeholders.
Sure. What advice do you have for how we move forward and address current and future priorities? Some of us have, such as water supply, sedimentation, and recreation, while also acknowledging and honoring what was taken so abruptly and carelessly from the Native American tribes. Is that even possible?
Well, I mean, I don't know. You know, the Corps of Engineers has over time become much more sensitive about these issues, and as I actually, you know, as I illustrated, there weren't any stakeholders that were confronted when it was implemented, but you know, now it has taken a number of steps to get input from all of the stakeholders, and you know, there's this Missouri River Recovery Plan, and there's a forum that's been created by the Corps and maintained by the Corps, called the Missouri River Recovery Implementation Committee, the MRRIC, or they like to call it Mr. Rick, which was established in 2007, and it provides recommendations for implementing the Missouri River Recovery Program. Now, it has like 70 members. It includes federal, state, regional, and local government representatives, but it also can conclude those that any interested party who is a non-government stakeholders. And there are about 29 tribal representatives in that forum. Now, I don't know what progress they've made. I attended one of their meetings about 10 years ago, again, where I was a keynote speaker. But at least those ideas are being discussed, and the Corps is aware of them. And, you know, in terms of tribal input, the Corps has really, you know, extended itself to tribes in terms of, and now it has a Native American coordinator in its office in the district office in Omaha. And, you know, because of these environmental legislation, tribes have, you know, it works tribes very closely in maintaining the identification and location sites and protection of cultural resources.
Michael, are you aware of how the voting works with Mr. Rick? Do the tribes have any voting power?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure of that. Yeah.
Okay.
I noticed that, you know, I mean, I looked at a recent list that they had 29, not, you know. I think that, I think I addressed a meeting that they had in Rapid City in 2012. And I know that some of the tribal representatives mentioned to me that they thought that they weren't, you know,
sure,
that their input wasn't being regarded as highly as they would hope.
Sure. I did get a response from one of our attendees is on Mr. Rick, and he indicated that yes, they do have voting power. I want to say one thing I have heard is that it seems like actions need a consensus, if that maybe our attendee would respond. But there was another question about the history of Pick-Sloan. If the Sloan plan, just the Sloan plan had prevailed, would the impact had been as great to the tribes?
Well, the Sloan plan really focused more on tributary dams. But I think it still had like 3 projects that it would have been on the main stem of the Missouri. And I don't know what the specifications of those were. I think that overall there would have been less. You know, I didn't talk about in the night, the Fort Peck Dam had a big impact on the tribes of the Fort Peck Reservation too. You know, like 350 families were moved by that project. So I think that the Sloan plan would have had less impact on the tribes.
Mhm. Okay. Let's see. I think we're getting close to the end of the questions here, unless there are any more. If there's anyone that would wish to speak, please indicate in the chat. I think we got all of them.
Well, I'd like to mention, Sandy, if there's anyone that would like to, has a question that they'd like me to answer privately, that they can contact me. My easiest email address is the word footnote, FOOTNOTE, the number 53, footnote 53 at AOL.com.
Okay. Okay, that sounds great. We do have a couple journalists on the call today, so we'll make sure that they have your contact information too, and we'll certainly send contact information to anyone who requests us as well.
And you could, you can also Google my company and contact me that way through MLL Consulting is the name of the company. So.
Okay, I'm gonna try typing your email you just mentioned here in the chat. Footnote 53 at AOL.com.
Yes.
Okay, and I'm gonna go find your book somewhere. I'm sure it'll be available online in a variety of places.
Well, it's
South
available.
Dakota.
It's available from the South Dakota Historical Society Press, which is, has an online thing. It's also available on Amazon. So.
Okay. Okay, great. Are you working on any other writing, or is that?
Well, my wife and I are writing a book about the Shinnecock Indians on Long Island in New York.
Oh, wow.
So.
Okay.
And we have that manuscript in the works. So, but.
Oh, wow. Okay. Well, we really appreciate your time, and we'll certainly be in touch. And let's see. I'm going to turn it back over to Mark here.
Okay. Thank you again, Michael.
Thank you again for inviting me. I appreciate it.
You bet. You bet.